Hey there. My day was turned upside down a bit this morning because Sony have launched the Sony A7C Mark II. So I want to talk a bit about that and some of the features on it. I have a Sony A7C right now, and it's my second camera to my Sony A7R IV. I bought the A7C about 2 years ago, and I did it because I decided I had all my APS-C Sony gear. I had a Sony A6000, I had a 6400, which I sold to get a 6600. And I found that I had all these APS-C Sony lenses and then all of these Sony full frame lenses. And I always felt like I was just spending way too much money and had way too much kit. So my solution to that was to sell all of my APS-C Sony stuff and replace the A6600, which was my compact body at the time, with a Sony A7C. And I got the trio of lenses that Sony launched at the same time as the A7C. Thank you, Sony marketing. But I find I use those lenses, and more importantly, the A7C, more than any other interchangeable lens camera that I've ever owned. If I need 2 card slots, I use the A7R IV. If I'm traveling or I'm just doing video like right now, then I do it on the A7C. So when the A7C Mark II was launched earlier on today, I was super excited and was all over the place trying to understand as much about it as possible. And I want to share with you now some of my thoughts on the spec sheet that we've got and all the information we've got, let you know what I think about the A7C and whether or not you should consider upgrading or just buying this camera in the future. So firstly, if you don't know what it is already, what is a Sony A7C? Well, an A7C is basically, the C is allegedly for compact, although Sony don't seem to be too clear about that, but let's assume it's for compact. The A7C, which came out a few years ago, I think it was in 2020, took the majority of what's in the A7 Mark III, and they put a lot of that into the A7C. They crammed it into a much smaller rangefinder style compact body. So it looks very, very similar to, say, the A6600 or now the A6700, but has a full frame sensor instead of a crop sensor. They had to do a few things to make that work. They had to redesign the shutter mechanism. And what you had then was a fantastic combination of lightness, compactness, and terrific sensor with great image quality. And that's what I have right now. With the Sony A7C Mark II, they've pretty much done the same thing. Looking at the current popular version of their Sony Alpha full-size range, they took the majority of what's in the A7 Mark IV and they've put that into this compact rangefinder body of the A7C Mark II. But what other features have they added and which ones have they taken away from the A7 IV? So let's start with that sensor. It's a 33 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor that comes straight out of the Sony A7 Mark IV. Compared to the one that's in the current A7C, which is a 24 megapixel sensor, as a photographer, you're not going to see a noticeable difference in the improvement in image quality from one versus the other. The time when a new sensor transformed the image quality from one model to another is pretty much behind us. If you compare sensors that were coming out, let's say 10, 15 years ago, every time you got a new sensor, you were going from 4 megapixels to 6, to 8, to 10, to 16, and then to 24. If you look at a lot of cameras, we've kind of stuck it around that 24 megapixel level. And the real reason for that is it's a really good compromise between image quality in terms of pixel size and also the noise that comes from those pixels, compared to what most users are looking for. So if you take a 33 megapixel sensor, that's the BSI CMOS sensor, which is this one that's in the A7 Mark II, A7C Mark II, you are going to see, if you pixel peep, which if you don't know what that means, it means drilling right down to a pixel level in your software of choice to see what the pixels look like, you're going to see a difference then. But you don't do that. Nobody does that unless you're reviewing a camera or you are cropping from the frame that you did to some great extreme, in which case maybe reframe it before you took the picture. I'm not being critical here. I'm just trying to reinforce that the marketing will have us believe that this is a completely different sensor and is going to transform your image quality. I'm going to tell you, as an amateur photographer with years of experience and a few weddings under my belt, you're not going to see a fundamental difference in image quality between this and the A7C if you just look at the sensor. Now, when it comes to the processor, that's slightly different. There is a Bionz XR processor in here, but there's also a separate AI engine as well that is making sure that you are tracking the right subject. I'll have to get my camera to be able to test it and verify it and then maybe share it with you. But crucially, the A7 Mark IV, on which this camera is based, doesn't have that separate AI processing unit. So this is actually one up for the A7C Mark II. It's got improved autofocus with tracking, 759 spots that you can focus on, and 94% coverage of the screen when it comes to that focusing. Anything that improves focusing accuracy, focusing ability in a camera is always going to be welcome. We're not really at a stage yet where the average user is going to be able to recover poor focusing in post-production in the way that you can recover highlights, shadows, etc., etc. You can't do that with focus yet. It'll shoot at 10 frames a second, which for most people is as fast as you'd ever want. But if you're doing sports, or you're seeing your kids run around, or your pets run around, then there are times when you do use 10 frames a second, even if it's only for a fairly short burst. It is actually the same though as we had on the old model. The old model was also 10 frames a second, which is probably recognizing that for most people, 10 frames a second is okay, is fine. There are some cameras that do 12 frames a second. Okay, would you really buy one camera over another because of 10 frames versus 12? I wouldn't. In-body stabilization is now up to 7.0 EV. That's super impressive. We'll test it in the real world, but that's a very, very impressive level of stabilization. 4K at 30 frames a second is full width on the sensor, so that's good news. It's actually sampled down from 7K. If you want 4K 60 frames a second, then that's going to have to be a crop. That's APS-C, which is about a crop of a 1.5. The big difference on video is we're getting 10-bit color now instead of 8-bit color, which is a significant improvement. So for people who are doing a lot of videos for it, with it, including me, then that's super exciting to have that 10-bit color. It also has S-Log3 and S-Cinetone, and you've also got 3 user attributable LUTs in the camera too, which is an interesting new feature we don't have on the current one. You'll be able to stream without any additional software through USB at 30 frames a second in 4K. I don't stream yet, but that's a useful feature if you stream. So you can basically use it as a high quality webcam. Looking at the outside of the camera now, there's not a huge amount of change. The body is a little bit heavier, but the width and the height of it are exactly the same as the outgoing model. There's an extra custom button. There's also a video or stills selector switch underneath the mode selector dial. The biggest difference though on the outside of the camera is the one that is really getting me the most excited about the whole camera. Frankly, even more than the sensor and the, well, maybe not the 10-bit color. I think that's important too. There is a front control dial now underneath the shutter on the front grip. This was missing on the first camera. This was missing on the A7C. I set all my cameras up in exactly the same way. I have that front dial controlling my aperture, and then the one on the back, which you access with your thumb, that's always setting shutter speed. This goes way back for me from the days when I couldn't remember which one was which. The front one was controlling the aperture because your lens is at the front of the camera. Your shutter curtain is at the back of the camera, and therefore the thumb wheel on the back of the camera controls shutter speed. Maybe I'm the only one who did that, but anyway, that's how I always did it and remembered it. With the A7C, there was no front dial under your index finger, so you had to use the scroll wheel instead. I don't like using that control scroll wheel for anything that involves rotating it, because inevitably I will always end up putting too much pressure on that dial at some point as I'm rotating it. And then suddenly I'm selecting ISO, or I'm selecting macro, or I'm selecting a different display mode through the viewfinder. It's intensely annoying. Even my Ricoh GR3, which is a lot smaller than the A7C, has got a front control wheel. So to have that on the A7C Mark II is for me a massive change and a massive and welcome improvement. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's excited about this, but I bet I'm probably one of the most excited people about this whole new feature. The screen on the back is still a flippy out screen in the same style as the A7C. For vlogging, that's perfect. It doesn't have that complicated one from the A7R5. The viewfinder hasn't really changed very much, except that it's now 0.7 magnification instead of 0.59. So that will be noticeably easier to look through. A lot of people complain about the viewfinder on the A7C. I just see that as one of the perhaps expected compromises of such a compact camera. And I say that for 2 reasons. One is it's a small camera, therefore you should probably have a smaller viewfinder on it. But probably more importantly, Sony has to differentiate this camera from others in its range. So putting every feature and every high-spec thing from more expensive, maybe more profitable cameras onto what some people would see as the entry-level full-frame camera from Sony, it wouldn't make sense for them from a marketing and product management perspective to do that. So it doesn't surprise me. People will say, well, why can't they do that? They probably can. They probably just choose not to. The rear screen is still a flippy out screen in the same style as the old one. It's articulated in the same way. So we don't have that complex one from the A7R5. I don't have an A7R5. I'm quite happy with the flippy out screen. It's so much better than the old tilt screen that we had on my A7R4, for example. So I'm quite happy with what we have there. The screen on the back is slightly higher resolution than it was before, so it's still not particularly good. Sony definitely is not the front runner when it comes to rear camera screen resolution and sensitivity. My Ricoh GR3, way nicer. Canon cameras from 10 years ago, way nicer. Sony, it's not your strength. Sorry, it just isn't. The published list price of this camera is $2,199 US plus tax, and that is body only. That is a bit of a hike up from the original A7C, which currently today retails at just under $1,800. I've seen it for a bit less than that and a bit more as well. But it does feel like this is a hike of maybe $300 or $400 compared to the original Sony A7C. So, should you buy it? Well, let me preempt this by saying I'm definitely going to buy it as soon as it's available from one of my main retailers, Amazon being the preferred one. Then I will be buying this camera body, and I will then do a comparison video with the A7C to really see what the differences are once it's in my hands. Should you buy this camera? Yes, if you're like me and you're using the A7C as either your main camera or as your backup or second or support body for your Sony full-frame system. If you're as excited as I am about that front dial and the 10-bit color, that's enough. I mean, really, those two things have got me sold already, and we've not even talked about the improvements in the menu system on the camera compared to the original Sony A7C. Those two features alone are enough to have me sell my current one and buy the new one as soon as it's available on Amazon. If you're in my position, I'd recommend you do the same. That's it, short video. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope this is useful. If it was, please like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.